Diploma in video production and editing. Welcome to lesson number 3. My name is William Eames. I am your course educator throughout this video production course. Thank you so much for joining me for lesson number 3. Just a quick refresher about who I am. I am the photography educator here in Shaw Academy, but I also have extensive experience here in video production and video editing as well. I do hope that you managed to join me for our first 2 lessons where we had a look at our basics of video, and we also had a look at how frames per second work and things like aspect ratio and resolution as well. We're going to step things up in this lesson. We're going to have a look at lenses, we're going to have a look at angle of view, and we're going to talk all about lens types. Now, lenses can be a little bit confusing at the best of times. They're essential to understand. It probably goes without saying, really, when it comes to capturing our video. Really important that we understand what we're using and when to use it at the right time as well. So, just a couple of things to talk about before we get in deep about our lenses. The first thing to talk about is our image sensor. So I've spoken about this a little bit in terms of when I was speaking about things like aspect ratio and how our image sensor works when we're recording video. And our image sensor is basically where the image is captured. Okay, so remember, when we're recording video, it's individual frames that are being captured very rapidly. Very similar to if we were taking a photograph, but imagine it happening 24 times a second. So they're made up of light-sensitive pixels. In other words, when the light hits our sensor, the pixels, the resolution, remember, our resolution is made up of the different pixels. They react to the light and they capture the light. And the amount of pixels that are available to us depends on the type of device that we're using. The size of those pixels will also change again, depending on the sensor size. The sensor captures and records the light and electronically creates a digital image. It controls the amount of time needed to capture a photo or video, of course, as well. And sensors are, as I mentioned, different sizes dependent on the device. Larger sensors will have a higher quality, and they'll also have a better depth of field, which is something we will cover a little bit later on in this course, but it is important to understand that larger sensors will give you a greater depth of field. Smaller sensors, you're going to struggle a little bit with it. So if you happen to be using your smartphone at the moment on this course and you're finding it a little bit difficult to get that nice out of focus background, a large part of that is to actually do with the size of your sensor. Now, why am I speaking about the image sensor? Well, it's very important when it comes to the context when we speak about lenses. Different devices have different sized image sensors. We have our full frame sensor, which is known as our 35mm sensor. This is the same size as our 35mm film, which the majority of celluloid films throughout the 20th century were shot on. And indeed, when it comes to still photography as well, 35mm dominated. But there are other sizes of sensors, again, depending on the type of camera that you happen to be using. APS-C would be another very popular one because this was the standard one when digital photography came into play. Micro Four Thirds, slowly beginning to kind of fall away, but for a while, when mirrorless cameras first came around, Micro Four Thirds was a very popular sensor size. And then if you happen to be using smaller devices like your compact cameras or perhaps even your smartphone, your sensor sizes are going to be even smaller again. So the reason that I speak about this is throughout this lesson, I'm going to be speaking a lot about measurements. I'm going to be speaking a lot about sizes and distances when it comes to images. And for that reason, because there's so many different sizes of sensors, we're going to stick with what is considered standard, which would be a 35mm sensor size. So if you happen to be using, say, something like a Canon EOS 6D or a 6D Mark II or a Nikon D750 or a Nikon D800 or something similar like the Sony A9 or the A7, these have 35mm 100mm frames, which is the standard frame size. Anything larger than that, you're getting into very expensive territory. You're getting into medium format territory, which is generally not used for filming. Okay, so when I speak about the lens ratios and everything like that throughout this lesson, just be aware I'm referring to a 35mm sensor size. You will need to check when it comes to your own device what the sensor size is. And indeed, if you're filming using a phone, you can pretty much just kind of not worry about this aspect of it now just for the moment. Okay, so now that we're hopefully all on the same page, let's get into our first topic, which is all about the essentials of lenses. Now, usually one of the first things that I get asked about when it comes to lenses is why are they measured in millimeters? And this is to do with what the focal length of the lens is. So if you ever look at your camera's lens, you may find that you've got these millimeters here. So for example, we've highlighted it here. It's a 100mm lens. What is that all about? Well, this is the distance where the image becomes focused within the lens, measured from the camera's sensor. Now, that might sound like a little bit of jargon. Let's break that down a little bit more. So, in other words, the lower the number here, the lower the millimeters, the wider the lens and the wider the photo and the video is going to be. Okay, so 100mm is kind of somewhere in the middle. It won't make sense until we actually look at some more examples of it. But when you're looking at your lens and you see that it says, say, 18mm on it, that's going to be very wide to compare to, say, 55mm, which is going to be a little bit more zoomed in. The higher the millimeters, the more zoomed in the image is. The lower the millimeters, the wider the image is going to be. Okay, so for example, if I have a 20mm lens, this is going to be very wide. If I go up to 200mm, this is going to be much closer. It's going to be more zoomed in. The difference there is 10 times. So if we have a look at this in a much more technical way, this is the point where the image comes into focus in the lens. And it's measured from the image sensor or film. As I mentioned, sensor size is also a factor, but let's just imagine we're using a standard sensor, which is our 35mm sensor. And if we have a look at it visually, I've got a 50mm lens here. And the point in that 50mm lens where the image becomes focused, where it becomes sharp and measured to this image sensor, that area is 50mm. And that is where those millimeters come from. So 50mm is a very small amount of space, but within that area, that point is 50mm where the image becomes focused, measured to where it is being captured on the image sensor. So you can imagine then, if I had a 24mm lens, that point is going to be much closer to the sensor. If I had a 400mm lens, the point is going to be much farther away from the image sensor. And for that reason, telephoto lenses are much, much larger. So a telephoto lens, the point where the image becomes in focus, measured to the image sensor, where it's captured, is much greater than if I were using a wide angle lens. Okay, so with a zoom lens, if you happen to have a zoom lens where it has a couple of different focal lengths mentioned on it, like 18 to 55mm is a very common one, that means that the focal point changes as you zoom in and you zoom out. Now, with all of that in mind, so throughout the rest of this lesson, I will be speaking about lenses in regards to their focal lengths, and again, using a 35mm sensor. Let's have a look at lens constructions. So there's 3 different types of lens constructions when it comes to video. Now, if you're a photographer, and you're coming from the photography course, you just happen to have a photography background, you generally are dealing with 2 types of lens constructions. That's zoom and that's fixed lenses. There is a third type of construction, which we'll speak about now in just a moment. But let's have a look at our zoom lenses first of all. So a zoom lens is any lens that has a variable or changeable focal length. Okay, so a zoom lens for beginners, it can be sometimes a little bit confusing because a lot of beginners think it means that it's a lens that does close-up photography, or it's a lens that means that you're very far away and you can still get very close to the subject. That's not what it means. A zoom lens is any lens where you can change the focal length. So, for example, with our 18 to 35 millimeter lens here, if I was photographing or if I was videoing with this lens, I would be able to start very wide at 18 millimeters, and then I could zoom in at any range up to 135 millimeters. Okay, so you can get any type of zoom lens out there. So if I want to shoot wide, I could shoot wide using a zoom lens, which would mean that I get a very wide shot, but I could still zoom in a little bit if I needed to. Or if I was using a telephoto zoom lens, I could start off at a still very close to the subject, but I could zoom in and get even closer because I have a telephoto zoom lens. Any lens that has different focal lengths on it, the ability to be able to zoom in and zoom out, is known as a zoom lens. Now, the opposite of that, for want of a better word, are fixed or prime lenses. Fixed or prime lenses are lenses that only have one single focal length available to them. So, for example, the 50mm Sigma lens that I have displayed here, it's only 50 millimeters. In other words, I can't zoom in, I can't zoom out. If I wanted to get closer to my subject, I have to physically get closer to my subject. If I wanted a wider shot, I have to physically take some steps back to get a wider shot. These are also known as prime lenses. Now, the reason they're known as prime lenses as well is that they tend to be higher quality than zoom lenses. They're less versatile because I don't have the ability to be able to zoom in or to zoom out. So I'm a little bit more restricted with my type of video when it comes to these types of lenses, but they do tend to be higher quality with a greater depth of field, and they also are preferred when it comes to video capture. Now, the third type of lens when it comes to video are cine lenses. Now, cine lenses are very specialized lenses when it comes to movies in particular. These are the top of the top lenses when it comes to any type of lens construction. And there's a couple of different reasons for that. Quality-wise, these lenses tend to be the sharpest lenses. They have the least amount of distortion, which is very important when it comes to wide-angle photographs or wide-angle shots. They also have perfect exposure, something a little bit more complicated, which we'll speak about when we continue on throughout this course. But they are also incredibly expensive. So when it comes to, say, a prime lens, a good quality prime lens, you could be spending up to $2,000 or €2,000 on that type of lens. You could get the equivalent in a cine lens, and it's going to cost you 4 times the price. And that's no exaggeration. So a 50mm prime lens for photography might cost you about $2,000. A 50mm cine lens will cost you about $8,000. And there's lots of different reasons for that. We're going to explore as we continue on throughout this lesson. Now, so I'm sure that you see that lenses, they can be a little bit complicated, but when we begin to break it down, it will make a little bit more sense. Now, let's have a look at some of our lens components. So let's take our photography lens now that we would use for filming. So this is a zoom lens. It's got a variable focal length. The very standard lens range, 24 to 70 millimeters. Now, it's a Canon lens that I'm showing you here, but we absolutely have no allegiance or to brands or anything like that. We just use the ones that are the best examples. But let's go through this and break it down in terms of exactly what we're looking at here, because there's a lot of vocabulary, there's a lot of numbers here, and it can be a little bit confusing. But when you break it down, it's actually quite straightforward. So the first thing to note is our current focal length. So at the bottom here, we've got a zoom lens. we can see that we're set to 24 millimeters, which we know now is a wide angle. But we could change that up to 70 millimeters and any focal length in between. We've got our zoom ring here as well. So if I want to zoom in or zoom out, I use that zoom ring. We have a distance scale, which is not available now on all lenses, but certainly if you're using higher quality and especially if you're using cine lenses, you will have a distance scale. This is all to do with focusing. This is all to make sure that you're focusing without having to look at the camera's LCD screen. We've got an AF or MF switch, that's autofocus or manual focus switch. We'll speak about that a little bit more, but when it comes to video, you tend to want to use manual focus. But autofocus is becoming much more advanced when it comes to video as well, so you can absolutely use that too. Our focusing ring will allow us to focus on the image. We've got a lens cap, pretty straightforward, will help you to protect the lens. We've got our aperture and our f-stop info. So just above the red ring there, lots of information there, as you can see. Canon zoom lens EF 24 to 70 millimeter, f1.4 IS USM. That's a lot of jargon. What does all that mean? Well, it means that we're a zoom lens. We can zoom in and out. EF is electronic focus. 24 to 70 millimeters is the focal length. The 1:4 ratio, that is our aperture information. We're going to have a look at apertures in lesson 6, so don't worry too much about that. IS USM is to do with image stabilization and ultrasonic motor. Now, these are much more to do with photography than they are to do with video. It's still important to understand what they are. We've got more lens information here, which again, it breaks down what that IS and USM are, image stabilizer, ultrasonic motor. We have our rear lens cap, which you absolutely need to attach to your lenses when you are not using them. If you have not got your lens attached to your camera, please use your rear lens cap, because the glass, the elements are so sensitive and so important that you have to protect them at all times. Now, the final lens construction type to speak about here are cine lenses. Now, these lenses are, well, they're the top of the top lenses when it comes to video capture. And certainly if you have a photography background, you would not be familiar with these lenses. And unless you're aiming for, to be a proper video producer, someone who really wants to get into the industry, you doubtfully will be using these lenses. But it's still important to understand them and how to use these types of lenses. First of all, here we have our focal length displayed. Generally, but not always, but generally, these types of cine lenses are fixed focal lengths. The reason for that is it's easier to focus them than if you happen to be using a zoom lens. But there are still the zoom lens versions available of these types of lenses. Here we have our aperture information. Now, one thing to understand is that when we speak about apertures, when we have a look at them in lesson number 6, we're going to talk about f-stops. F-stops are all to do with depth of field. What's in focus and out of focus in the background, depending on the f-stop number that you happen to use. If you are using a cine lens, you're going to be talking about T-stops. T-stops are a little bit more complicated because it's more to do with exposure as well as the depth of field, and maintaining the correct exposure as you change lenses and you change shots is essential when it comes to capturing video. Again, very complicated information. We will dig much deeper into it when the time comes, but for now, just be aware that you measure your f-stops on a cine lens as T-stops. Now, we also have our focus ring, and now this is threaded for gear changes. So in other words, generally, when you are focusing with a cine lens, you're not going to be using your hands. You're going to be using a device. You're going to be using a focus grip that would allow you to change the focus by rotating the grip. So for that reason, you have these gears here involved instead. With cine lenses as well, you will find that you've got a lot more numbers when it comes to that focusing. That's because they're to be read by both sides. So it's a collaborative thing generally when you're using cine lenses. So you'll find a lot of numbers repeated on these types of lenses simply because they need to be read by both the left and the right side. We've got our focusing distance here so that again, whoever happens to be looking at the focusing can see the exact measurement that's needed when it comes to focusing. And again, these numbers tend to be repeated on both sides of the lenses. Now, cine lenses also are what is known as declicked. In other words, when we're changing our focus and we're changing our aperture, it's very, very smooth. There's no changes in terms of the gears, especially when it comes to the aperture. Sometimes when you're changing aperture on photography lenses, you actually might hear the clicks or you might hear the stops. When it comes to these types of lenses, there's complete smoothness, so you won't hear those clicks because, of course, when it comes to the sound, that's also very, very important as well. These types of lenses also are much higher quality when it comes to the exposure and when it comes to the distortion on the edges of the lenses too. But as I mentioned before, you're paying a much, much higher price for these, this quality of lens. Now, these are something we'll come back and we'll have a look at a later stage. It is just important to be aware of them now at this stage. But if we kind of return back to our standard lenses and we talk a little bit about zoom as well, if you happen to be using an all-in-one type of lens, so say the type of lens that you'll find on a mobile phone, or perhaps you've got a type of camera where you cannot change the lens on it, you will tend to have different options when it comes to the zoom. So our optical zoom is one basically where you can zoom in and out using the camera lens itself. So you may have a little control like the W and the T, the wide and telephoto that we looked at in a previous lesson. The lens zooms in and out itself. This means we can change from a wide angle to a zoomed in angle. They're usually measured in multiplication. So whether it's 3 times or 5 times or 10 times, it can be up to 30 times, even beyond that, depending on the type of camera that you're using. And this means, for example, if you're, say, using a smartphone, lenses tend to be about 22 millimeters. And if I have a 3 times optical zoom, it's going to be a maximum of 66 millimeters. That's different from what we call a digital zoom. And digital zoom is where the zoom is done by zooming in on the actual pixels of the image itself. Okay, so this is different from an optical zoom, which is done through the lens. So we're effectively zooming in on the photo or the image itself or the video itself, and more pixels will mean a better digital zoom. Now, when it comes to video, as we've seen, we're selecting our resolution. We're more than likely going to be shooting in full HD or 4K. If we're shooting in 4K, this is going to give us a much greater range to actually zoom in on the image if needed. But usually digital zoom is poor quality and should only be used as a last resort. Now, so we understand our constructions when it comes to different lenses. Let's have a look at the angle of view. Let me ask you a question when it comes to angle of view. What is the full range of human vision? So I want you to think about this and I'll give you some options here. What is the full angle, I should say, of human vision? And is it 100 degrees? Is it 130 degrees? Is it 160 degrees? Or is it 190 degrees? So try this yourself. Look straight forwards and try to see and try to guess how much of an angle of vision that you have that you can see, and try to answer this question. Is it 100 degrees, 130 degrees, 160 degrees, or 190 degrees? And well, the total angle of human vision altogether, including our peripheral vision, is indeed 130 degrees. 130 degrees. So if we think about, again, when you look straight forward, you're going to have a focused field of vision, a focused range of vision, but you can still get a sense of what's happening beside you, on your left and your right hand side. And that is your peripheral vision. And that is something we have developed as people. It's a survival instinct so that we have some awareness of what is happening around us. But when we actually speak about what's directly in front of us and what we focus on, well, that field of vision is actually much, much smaller and is 50 degrees. Only 50 degrees. So that focused field of vision that we see when we look straight forward and we're looking directly at something is about 50 degrees. Now, this is really important to understand when it comes to using different types of lenses and different types of focal lengths, because these lenses all have different angles of vision. And basically, when we're changing these lenses, we need to be aware of this, because some lenses are going to be much, much wider than our focused field of vision, and some lenses are going to be much, much narrower. So, for example, if I happen to be using, say, a 14mm lens to capture some very wide shot, it's 114 degrees angle of vision. And this is much, much wider than what we can see even with our peripheral vision. So I always need to be sure to check the edges of my shot. It's also sometimes why, these kind of images and these kind of videos can look a little bit unusual to our eyes sometimes, because we're actually seeing far more than what we normally see when we're simply looking forward. This goes for a lot of very, very wide lenses. It's only when you start getting into the 20mm range that you start getting within our peripheral field of vision, and it's only then when you get up to about 50mm lenses that you're actually in the focused field of vision, what we typically see on a daily basis. And then getting into our telephoto lenses, our telephoto ranges, that field of vision becomes extremely narrow, as you can see if you were photographing, say, if you're videoing with a super telephoto, you'd be going with something like a 600mm lens. Your field of vision is extremely narrow at only 4 degrees. And this makes it a little bit tricky to use lenses at both these extremes, whether it's super wide, extreme wide, or super telephoto. You can take a little bit more practice with these types of lenses compared to when we're using those mid-range lenses closer to our own focused field of vision. Now, so let's just make this visual so you understand exactly what I'm talking about. And here we've got a very nice wide shot. And this scene was photographed, in this particular case, photographed with a 14mm lens, which is a very wide focal length. Remember, the lower the number, the wider the lens is going to be, and this gives us a very wide view. So in a situation like this is much, much wider than our focused field of vision and our peripheral vision as well. So you'd always want to be sure to check the edges of the frame to make sure that there's no interference, that there's nothing creeping into the shot that you're not going to be able to remove afterwards. We can zoom in a little bit more. We change our lens a little bit. We go up to a 24mm lens, which is a standard wide angle. And we can see here there's much less distortion in this type of image. So we're losing a little bit on the edges of the frame. But the overall shot still gives us a very kind of wide sense of place here in this particular scene. Let's get in a little bit closer and we'll change up to a 50mm lens now, which is our standard lens. This is very, very close to the human eye in terms of its focused field of vision. And this, if we were happen to be in this particular scene and we were standing here on the edge of this lake, we would see something very, very similar to this with our own vision. Now, if we change again then and we decide that we want to get even closer in this scene, we can then go up to a 100mm lens, which actually doubles what we would normally see with our focus field of vision. Now what you're seeing, I mean, the shot is beginning to change. We're losing a lot on the edges of this image. And we're much more, I suppose, focused as the viewer on what's happening within the center of the frame. We're much more focused on these mountains and the edges, and indeed, that kind of valley that we see just in front of us with the clouds hanging over it. And we can double this again by going up to a 200mm lens. Now here we can see that we really are not paying attention to the edges at all. We're focused very much on what's happening in the center, and that mountain here over on the left-hand side in particular. But all of these shots are very, very different from each other simply by zooming in. Now, all of these shots as well, there's no right or there's no wrong. They simply change just by changing our focal length. And this is something you need to be very, very aware of when it comes to capturing video, is that you can change a shot entirely depending on the type of focal length that you use. That focused field of vision, that angle of view that changes when you change your lens, is very much determining what you're choosing to show the viewer. A telephoto lens is going to be very focused and very narrow with its angle of vision. So your subject is going to be very direct, where if you're photographing or you're videoing with a very wide lens, you're perhaps giving the viewer a little bit more room to choose what they want to look at in the frame and within the scene. Now, so moving on to our final topic for this lesson, let's have a look at the different types of lenses that are available to us when it comes to filming. So there's hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of lenses that are out there. It can be very, very difficult to know which one to use. But let's try to break it down a little bit more to make your decision a little bit easier when it comes to choosing the right lens. So first of all, if you happen to be using a smartphone, smartphones will have built-in lenses. Okay, so I know a number of you are going to be filming and going to be using your smartphones primarily to capture your footage. Now, many smartphones will typically only have one lens, but as phones become more advanced, they will have 2 or 3 lenses, and these are typically a standard, a wide, and a telephoto lens. Now, these types of lenses can also be upgraded in a sense where you can attach other lenses to them, or if you happen to just be using one lens at the moment, where you can get kits that will actually give you many more options. So ranges from €10 to up to €100 plus, depending on the quality that you go for. There's lots of different options available to you. If I was to recommend one brand, Moment are definitely the ones to go with when it comes to quality, but you will be paying more for these types of lenses, and you can buy them anywhere online or your local camera shop as well. So if you happen to be using your smartphones primarily to capture footage at the moment, well, you can buy these types of lenses, but I also actually recommend, we do have a smartphone photography course, which also covers smartphone video. I teach that course as well, so you can check that out too. But just be aware that if you happen to be using your phone, that all the lenses that I mention here in the next section are also available in some type of form for your phones as well. Now, so let's start off by having a look at our general lenses. So our standard lenses designed for all round use. These would be the ones that are closest to our focused field of vision, but they do have quite a range from 24 to about 105mm. So you're going from quite wide to just about telephoto if you happen to go for a zoom version of these types of lenses. And these are good all-rounders. So if you bought yourself an SLR, or perhaps you're using a mirrorless camera, most likely you're going to have a general type of kit lens that's going to cover your basic everydays, the majority of things that you're going to be filming, from landscapes to people to street, and if you happen to be filming in studio. Aperture ranges will vary. Now, don't worry so much about your apertures at this stage. We will be looking at them in much greater detail in lesson number 6. but just be aware that they can vary greatly depending on the quality of the lens. It's a great lens to start with. Generally, as I mentioned, included as a kit lens with most cameras that you purchase nowadays. They are also available as fixed or zoom versions, which goes for every single lens that we have a look at throughout this next section. So for example, you could get an 18 to 55 millimeter lens, or you could have a fixed version of a 50 millimeter lens, and so on. So as I mentioned, these types of lenses, when it comes to filming, are generally going to be used for standard everyday shooting. So if you're into doing a little bit of filming on the street, great for that type of work. If you're into doing a bit of portraiture, great for that as well, and indeed for doing a bit of landscape video footage too. Now, going up to an extreme, let's have a look at our telephoto. And telephoto lenses are used for filming and capturing stuff that is far away from us that we can't get close to. So anything above 70 millimeters is going to be considered telephoto, up to about 300 millimeter range. You can go beyond that. That's super telephoto. We'll speak about them in just a second. But these are going to be a very narrow field of view. So just remember, the more that you're zooming in, the closer to the subject that you're getting with these types of lenses, you've got a very narrow field of view. It can make them a little bit tricky to use when you are filming. So you kind of need to take a little bit of time to set up your shot when using these types of lenses. They're used for wildlife and sports, but they can be used for street if you're trying to be candid about your video footage, and for portraiture as well. They're great for doing deep focus. We'll speak about that in the next lesson, deep focus when it comes to filming people too. So they're not as limited as you may think. They are actually still a very versatile lens, but they are also a higher price than your standard lenses because they're more into specialist territory. Fast versions, in other words, versions that have a very wide aperture range, will come at a very high cost. So fast version, in layman's terms, basically means something that's very, very good at in low light situations, or gives you a very nice depth of field. But unfortunately, you will absolutely pay the price. And as I mentioned, they can be tricky to use because of that narrow field of vision, and very, very heavy as well. And they're also more prone to camera shake. So you would definitely need to be using something like a tripod or Steadicam or a monopod or something like that to make sure that you keep your shot nice and steady. But as I mentioned, these are typically going to be used for your wildlife and your sports situations where you cannot get very close to your subject. If you're restricted in any type of way in getting physically close to your subject, you're more than likely going to need to use a telephoto lens. Now, as I mentioned as well, we can go with super telephoto versions. This is basically anything above the 300 millimeter range. So you're getting into very specialist territory using these types of lenses. These are extremely expensive as well. You're at the very minimal, you're going to be spending about $1,000 on these types of lenses. They're also very physically large, which means they're very, very heavy as well. And they are primarily for sports and wildlife video capture and photography. Not that you can't use them for other types of video capture as well, but typically would be used in those situations. And again, you're probably going to be needing a monopod or a tripod to make sure you've got that extra bit of support there to keep things nice and steady. Now, they also typically will have a number of image stabilizers within them as well. Again, depending on the type of brand, the camera that you use or the type of lens, the image stabilizer may be located in the lens or in the camera itself. But again, very much used for sports or for wildlife situations where you're going to find it very, very difficult to get to your subject. But certainly for a shot like this, you would be using something like a super telephoto. Now, moving the other way to our wider lenses, let's have a look at our wide angle lenses, typically from 24 millimeters, and anything less than that are considered wide angle. takes in more into view than our focus field of vision. So always remember to check the edges when you're using these types of lenses. Some distortion will appear at the edges the wider that you go. Now, if you're lucky enough to be using cine lenses tend to reduce that distortion as much as possible. But again, remember you're paying extreme prices for them. So if you're using your standard photography lenses for capturing video, just be aware that you may end up with a little bit of distortion, a little bit of curvature at the edges of your frame. And they're used for landscapes, architecture, and street. You can absolutely use them for portraits as well. But care is needed because you can, as I mentioned, distort the face if you're using a wide-angle lens. So you want to make sure that your composition is correct, where your subject is placed just at the very at the very edge of the where the distortion just begins in the lens. They're also great for night sky video and night sky photography too, which we'll speak about when we get onto all about lower light video capture. These types of lenses are great for landscapes and what we call establishing shots. So we'll speak about establishing shots in the next lesson, but these are absolutely fantastic for doing a shot that kind of gives people a sense of place immediately. A wide shot of what's going on, an overview of where you're filming, and putting into people's minds exactly what your video is going to be all about. So establishing shots, we'll speak about them, as I said, in the next lesson in much more detail, but they're also great for doing landscape video too. Now, going even wider than that, we can go extreme and go with our super wide, where we can have a look at a 10 to 15 millimeter range. So this is extremely wide, very wide angle of view. Now, again, we're talking specialist lenses, so these would be very, very expensive as well. Primarily would be used for landscapes, but indeed for interior shots as well. Very distorted at the edges, can be corrected, however, in post-production. Again, this will also depend on the quality of the lens that you happen to be using. These are great for panoramics, for doing shots that give an extremely wide sense of space. So for something like this, a really dramatic type of landscape, a very, very wide angle lens for this. And they're also great for doing interior shots as well. So if you happen to be filming an interior for any reason, you want to be looking at your wide or your extreme wide lenses. Now, moving on from them to another specialist type of lens are fisheye lenses. Now, these are even wider at an 8 to 15 millimeter range. As you can see, very distinct, very curved elements here to create that distinct fisheye look. They're very fun to use. They are also very pricey for what they are, and I do think they're very limited in what you can do with them as well. They're synonymous with GoPro video, GoPro cameras. I'm sure you're familiar with them from watching videos on YouTube and so on. The amazing things that people do with them. They use fisheye lenses. The idea is that they get everything into the shot. They're great for extreme sports and for things like music videos. And again, very, very good for night sky. A shot like this, for example, would be done with a fisheye lens. So kind of skateboarding, extreme sports, windsurfing, standard surfing and so on, snowboarding, etc. You might use something like a fisheye lens to give it that distinct look. As you can see here on the skateboard itself, there is a curve happening here on it. That's because a fisheye lens has been used to capture this particular image. Now, the final lens to have a look at in this lesson are macro lenses. Now, again, these are very specialist lenses that are used for doing extreme close-up photography. Macro photography or macro video enlarges your subject beyond life size. They're available at various focal lengths. They are usually a fixed lens. It is possible to get zoom versions, but higher quality ones tend to be fixed lens, like the Canon 100mm one here. They're designed for closer focusing. So with a standard lens, you may find that you reach a certain limit when you get in close on your subject. This is known as the minimal focusing distance. The idea behind a macro lens is that they can go beyond this minimal focusing distance to get even closer in on the subject. They are more expensive than regular lenses, but they're also great for portraiture as well. But primarily, of course, they are going to be used for capturing macro wildlife, for food as well, and for flowers. So if you're filming, anything like that, you may decide to invest in a macro lens. They're a lot of fun to use as well, and they really give you kind of new options to explore when looking at the world around you, because you look at things in much greater detail and look at all the small things that happen around you. Now, so that is the end of our lesson on lenses. I do hope that you enjoyed it. We certainly added a lot to our skills today. Certainly our technical ability, our creative vision and communication all take a good bit of a jump after this lesson, because lenses are so important to capturing video. Understanding lenses is essential. So you've now taken a big step in improving the quality of your video capturing ability. And that's all because you're now going to be able to choose the right lens for the right scene, which we're going to add upon in the next lesson. We speak all about composition. Now, if at any stage you may be happening to struggle a little bit with the lessons, or you just want to keep the information from the course, it is possible as well to buy the summary notes, an optional purchase available in your toolkit. Covers everything that we keep in the lessons, and you can print them off, if you want to, and you can pop them into your camera bag, or just to keep them for reference for yourself long after the course is finished. Now, remember, all summary notes and slides are available in your toolkit and be really worthwhile to keep as a resource at your fingertips beyond this course. But no sneak peeks. The lesson notes will only become available after you have attended your classes or caught up with the lessons. This will also help you to prepare for your first module assignment, which we'll speak about a little bit more later on in the course. Now, in this area as well, remember that you can watch recordings, you can change your class date and time, or restart the entire course if you need to as well. So we want to make sure that we give you every opportunity to complete this course in your own way and in your own time. So always check your student area for updates, for all your resources. And as I said, if you need to restart anything, you'll be able to do that through your student area. Now, let's have a quick look at what's coming up in lesson 4. As I mentioned, we're going to talk all about composition and movement. So now that we have a good technical understanding of how our cameras work, how frames per second work, how our lenses now work as well, and being able to choose the right lens for the right scene, we're now going to be able to get creative, really dig into the creative side of things and have a look at how we can compose and how we can add dynamic movement to our video capture. So be sure to join me for that lesson. For your challenge, a pretty straightforward challenge, I'd like you to shoot the same scene at 2 different focal lengths. So just capture the same scene. You could set up a little simple scene for yourself and capture it at 2 different focal lengths, and using the hashtag Shaw video on Instagram, Twitter and Facebook. If possible, post them onto Instagram, Twitter and Facebook. But it's worthwhile doing these challenges, even if you don't intend on posting them or sharing them, to keep up and to put into practice everything that we learn throughout this course. So we're way over time. I'm going to finish out the lesson there. So thank you once again for joining me for this lesson. We've completed 3 lessons now. So I'll see you all back here again very, very soon for lesson number 4. Until then, bye-bye.